Welcome to our Zoomcast recording of a discussion between Pamela Jones, a faculty member in the childhood programs, and Cecelia Traugh, Dean of the Graduate School at Bank Street College. There is a guest appearance from Gabs, a green bean loving cat.
This conversation focuses on the need for the development of racial consciousness in teacher education programs.
I guess, would you like to start or would you like me to start or?
Why don't you start? You got going there. You can start.
Sure. I do have some notes to get me to give myself some structure for this piece. I'll try not to do the whole reading of it or anything, but just to
Well, I do too. So we're on the same boat.
Yep. Yes. As kids say, brain match.
Yes.
So that, as I was saying before, that I entered this work from the location of a Black girl, as I say, like 3 and 4 year old, but really for me, 4 was the year that I kind of came into my consciousness for myself. And then a Black woman from a particularly racially charged part of the Midwest. And I was socialized to perform whiteness in ways that I didn't realize until really recently. I mean, I always knew it, but I didn't know the extent to which I was socialized to perform whiteness. I mean, I was socialized to shout the merits of the dominant culture, which was white, and those ways of being and whisper about my Blackness, my otherness, being othered. And I remember even in elementary, maybe 2nd, 3rd grade, I was in a school that was racially diverse, but still fewer students of color than white students. And the things that I would bring up in terms of just culturally relevant things in my life were things that did not resonate with my friends, but I knew what they were talking about, but they almost never knew my cultural references. And I thought, that is so weird. And of course, then what was happening was at my like 6, 7, 8-year-old self, I was experiencing what Du Bois called that double consciousness, where you ever feel your two-ness. But I couldn't say, I'm having a Du Boisian moment. It was just happening. But that's what was happening when I finally read Du Bois. Of course, years later, I was like, that's what I was feeling in 2nd grade, but I didn't know what to name it. But thank you, W.B. Du Bois. I was always trying to make sense of why I always knew it was happening in the dominant culture and in white culture, but I didn't have that same reciprocity from others. And there was something a piece that I'm working on for a while, but thinking about how rest is a form of resistance for Black women and women of color because of the way that the world is. And I wrote, having been socialized to respect fear, and that's from Audre Lorde, the brilliant Audre Lorde, that mine is a project of unlearning and reimagining myself otherwise. Inside of this grown Black woman working as a teacher educator and completing her dissertation in predominantly white institutions resides a young Black girl pained by decades of palpable silences. The contested space that was my Black girlhood remains as contested as it ever was. While my 4-year-old self could not articulate it, she sensed that Black women's voices roar and hold a certain sway that strikes fear into whiteness. And so I was saying that I was socialized to be proud of my Blackness in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I received messages to the contrary, that Blackness was situated as liability, a deficit, and to thrive, I had to learn to perform. And anti-Blackness was really real in ways that I couldn't name, but that I could really feel. And then as I got older, I was negotiating those dueling identities. And something that Dr. Greg Carr says, kind of like along the stage of this awakening, as Django Paris said last year, that ongoing awakening that we go through when we're doing this work. Dr. Carr described it beautifully as like that disruption without exile. So when you're a person of color and you're disrupting, but you do so stopping short of disrupting in a way that ruffles feathers. And how, for me, I've been stuck in that stage for quite a while. And so I'm moving myself out of that stage in the last few years because I need to grow to the next phase of my development. But it's always there. I'm always fighting that. So that is a part of my ongoing awakening of growing, I guess, less tolerant of tiptoeing around the issues of racism and anti-Black racism and bias writ large. And that for me, it's about thinking about, acknowledging, and working through, going back to that archaeology, but like there has to be a level of courage that I'm cultivating in myself, that I'm far from having any real full actualization with, but it's definitely IP in progress. But I'm really being conscious of the ways that I'm growing my courage to stay in it, and to not pull back so that I sustain my engagement. And I'm working this out every day.
Yeah. Yeah. As am I, but from a different vantage point. So since I mentioned that four-year-old, I hadn't really thought to include it, but I think I actually wasn't 4. I think I must have been about 3. Lived in San Diego in a big apartment house, a big old house that was an apartment building. And there was a wire fence between where I was and the other yard. And I was out there and with my mother, and we were going someplace. But I saw this little girl across the fence who was sort of looking through the fence wire. And what I remember distinctly is, and I only saw her the one time, and we never had any interaction, but she was a Black girl, and I knew she wasn't the same color as I was. And I was really intrigued. But we were going off, and she never appeared again. But it's such a clear memory to me. Now, I grew up in Southern California, surrounded by folks from Mexico, and particularly in the sections that I lived in, and Japanese people. And I went to school, in elementary school, I went to school with kids from Mexican families, some of them, and a lot of language that I wouldn't use at all now, even to say it, around the folks who crossed the river illegally and those who had been here for some generations, but many generations, because California was really the first European kind of settlers actually were from the Spaniards from Mexico. So anyway, but Japanese children, and those Japanese children had either they had already been born before World War II or were born in the concentration camps, but had spent a good part of their life in concentration camps. Now, I didn't know that when I was a child, but I learned that after. It was, when I was a grown-up person, I realized, oh my goodness. And I have a close friend now I worked with when I was at Lehman College that she spent part of her childhood, yes, they were living in Los Angeles and spent part of her childhood in one of those concentration camps. So, so I think a lot about that, and I'm, as I said before, I have a very long life here. So I'm not, I don't want to go through all the pieces of it that have had a real impact on me in terms of who I am and how I've been enabled to think about things. But I thought, in thinking about this part of our conversation ahead of time, I thought about mentors I've had. And one mentor, really important to me on a lot of different levels, was a fellow by the name of Vito Perrone. He's an Italian, very Italian, grew up, he was the son of Italian immigrants. But he was the dean at the University of North Dakota, and I came there as the associate dean. And I worked alongside him in many projects, but one project that we had that was a long-term project, important piece of work, was bringing educating teachers, Native American teachers who were living on the reservations to teach on the reservations, so that the Indian schools, the Native American schools, would be taught, the children would be taught by their mothers, their fathers, their aunts and uncles, their people. And this was not the case, very typically. And so that was we went all over the state and worked in that way. What I learned from Vito, first of all, it brought me to a whole area of experience that I had not had. The North Dakota is a very particular culture, and certainly the Sioux and all had really important contributions there. But it was his urgency for this project that was really deeply important. That is what I remember. So, and the fellow feeling that I saw with him and the folks with whom we worked. And those are the things that I remember. So there are many things about Vito that I remember, but in this regard, remember so strongly. So.
May I ask you, Cecelia, about that example? What specifically has stuck with you and still resonates so deeply and informs your current work now as dean and the work that we're doing at the college? Like, when you think about Vito and that work and that project, that undertaking, how does it inform you today in your role guiding, the graduate school and doing this work on racial consciousness?
Well, I think there are literal ways it does, and there are less literal ways it does. But literally, it gives additional importance to me to our urban ed early childhood cohort, where we go into the community to work with people rather than just hoping that people come to us. Being embedded in a community, working with community organizations. That's what we were doing there in North Dakota. That's what that project is about. And so when I came to Bank Street, that was just underway. And that has been a very important project that I support, been really working hard to support and maintain it. So that's one. The competency-based program with early childhood, again, it's working with a community of people who don't have access to what Bank Street has to offer. In North Dakota, it wasn't having access to a university education, basically. So it's and the certification process. And so it's providing the importance and the urgency of providing access where access hasn't been. So I think those are that's a major direct connection with this work that I do now. Another piece. Go ahead. Because
one thing that comes to, you're good Zoom screen reader. I try to see, I see someone has a question. They're like, how'd you know? I'm like, I can read faces. Which is and thank you for that answer. It was really rich and it gave me a lot to think about, which is why I have this other question. And it kind of connects to my current teaching, this fall with foundations, but in thinking about First Nations and Indigenous populations. And I'm always thinking about, again, it all goes back to archaeology. That's one of my main metaphors for teaching. So a lot of what I do when I'm reflecting on this or any other topic goes back to archaeology. But when I go back to unearth previous moments that inspired me, like the one you just shared about the work with Vito, or ones that I'm thinking of that you're sparking in my imagination about people and experiences that really pushed me forward and gave me a frame like, epiphany had. I'm going to hold on to that one kind of forever. Now I'm at the stage where I'm going back and looking at those moments and seeing where I would push them further. because I now have deepened and grown more critical. And I'm doing more excavation. I'm thinking like, what would Pam now in 2020? How would she, right? How would Pam in 2020 react to the situation, event, situation, etc., from 1995 or 2000, or where I thought then like, this is it, and where then it wasn't. But what I know now, I'm like, oh, that was it then, but this is where I would push this now, right? And so not that you have to answer this, but I'm just always so into thinking in those thought experiments about if you were to go and do and embark on that work with Vito now, right? If that were happening now, or thinking about the work that you were naming that's so rich at the college, the ways they were doing this work, the ways you would push that project in the Dakotas, if you would push them any differently. Just a question and idea that I had.
Yeah, I don't know. It was a while back. So I was a pretty young educator at that time, actually. But Vito and I shared, we were both historians. And so we both shared a real deep interest in the Dakotas, in the politically progressive history of the Dakotas. And you wouldn't know that now from things that are happen politically in the Dakotas, but they have a long rooted history of political progressivism, which, however, were for more of the white settlers, not the native peoples. So, there's a very rocky and difficult history there between the native peoples and the white folks who have taken many aspects of their land, etc. So I wouldn't say I should have learned more, because we pressed ourselves to learn a lot, and it was all new to me. And so I was very, I tried to immerse myself in the history of the relationship, etc. So I don't know any more than that, other than something to think about. You also work with people like I worked with Vito, and I wouldn't necessarily even presume to think how I could push him. There were certainly ways, I'm sure, but I wouldn't even presume. He's that kind of figure in my life.
Mm-hmm. We all have those figures in our lives.
Yeah, we do. If we're really lucky, we have a number of them. Yeah.
I mean, when your example, I know we were going to go on the next question about cultivating an atmosphere of candid discussions.
Oh, but I'm not done with my biography.
Oh, that's right. That's right. This was a
deep. I have just barely scratched the surface.
That's right. We're going to go back to that. Indeed. For and the capitalize on being asleep. But
because I can, in your question, in terms of what has affected me, in terms of my work at Bank Street, and I mentioned here that I am a historian. That's what I have a master's degree in history. And when I got my doctorate in curriculum, it was a lot about social studies and all historical curriculum. So that's a major piece of my work. And if I'm going to think about oh great, this one can be that is a major piece now. And if we think about mentors, just to follow that thread, these are more literary mentors, but the idea that it matters where you begin and the story you tell yourself matters is a major idea that it's an idea I have that's deeply rooted in me, and that comes from a study of history, I think, but it also has been added to in in more recent times with, mentor books stamped from the beginning, In a Shade of Blue, the Glaude book, the 1619 Project, and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Those are all draw on history, draw on biography, draw on, and those are major threads, and the importance of really thinking about, and I'm going to say this again, the story we tell ourselves, which is a Glaude phrase. That is, I think, so important when we think about the story Bank Street tells itself. When we think about how it began, it matters where you begin. How did it begin? And that I feel is really critical set of questions. When we think about the stories people tell themselves when they want to erect the statue of a Confederate general, pull that statue down, maintain that statue. All of that are part of the stories we tell ourselves. And I think that, and with a deep interest in how kids are educated historically and how our teachers and school leaders are educated historically. Do they know the history? Are they connected with that? What story do they tell themselves? So that's a big piece for me. And then I'm going to say a last big piece for me in thinking about, we used the phrase pedagogical DNA at another time. So I've been thinking about what my pedagogical DNA has been. And that descriptive inquiry piece is a very big piece for me. And it relates to this because I'm white, I am not I'm usually not the other. You spoke about, you being the other. I'm usually not the other. And when I work with teachers and they're describing children and working with children, those children are often other to them. And the thing for me is about descriptive inquiry is it really does try to center the child and her interests over the adult's interests and being the adult being the center. It tries to understand that child, that other person, in their terms, not just in the teacher's terms. And that is there are many other aspects I could go on about, but I'll just center on that one. That child is unique, not exchangeable with you, not the same as you. That is a critical piece, I think, for all of us as educators to hold. And it is, I think, deeply related to what we do as educators of teachers, as education school leaders. Because one of the worst problems, I think, is when we think everybody is like us or should be like us, needs to be like us. So I was just listening again to the speech from the language series, and talking about how we hear other people's language, and if it's not like ours, it's not adequate. It's the same issue.
No, absolutely.
So those are pieces of my my biography and my DNA, if we want to think about it that way. Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate that, and I went back to make sure. I think I have the person who said this at that workshop where I heard that phrase, pedagogical DNA. I think the person's name is Alprentice McCutcheon. That's what I wrote down at least. Thank you, Alprentice McCutcheon. If it's not you, sorry, but I think it's Alprentice McCutcheon. Yeah, I mean, I think that they were probably not going linearly, and that's actually beautiful in our discussion, because I think that it really is circular and it comes back and it goes up and down a ladder of abstraction. But I think that you sparked in me the thinking about what we do to engage in these conversations. And I think that it starts in thinking about our biography in this work, but then going into how we do cultivate the disposition to have these conversations. And one of those ways for me also is diving deeply into the literature, and really thought-provoking, hard pieces of literature, ones that are on the beaten path and ones that go off the beaten path. And I think that every teacher who's seeking to be and do the work from an anti-racist stance should be a teacher, a student of history, a critical student of history, and to go back deeply into history. And that's what I'm striving to do. I mean, I have a long way to go, but it's a beautiful struggle to immerse ourselves in these pieces of literature, both physical text and also video and audio, because we have so many different ways to listen and engage and take things in now, and especially that we're all on this digital lockdown in a way, that there's so many new offerings that are coming to us that wouldn't be available otherwise. You know, and so like you, there's so many people who, like, I know you've already read it. I've just begun reading Begin Again.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, it's very good. And I've loved James Baldwin for years, but it's good to hear Eddie Glaude talk about and really distill those salient aspects of, you know, people call him Uncle Jimmy, you know, Uncle Jimmy's work and his body of work. And then I saw a beautiful short in the New York, I guess, Film Festival last week. It was up for just a minute. It was a 17-minute or maybe 20+ minute documentary of James Baldwin. And it was fascinating. Fascinating. I hadn't seen it before. It gave me a lot to think about, as he always does. But thinking about what is our syllabus, right? Like, what is our personal syllabus that we're curating? And that should always be growing. That's going to help us lean in to do this work. And I think that that's one of the many ways that I grow myself to be able to have these and growing conversations about race, so that they don't find themselves in this static place. And for me, I can't move the discussion away from my location of a Black woman, because for so long that was something that did go unnamed for me. Because again, taught to perform whiteness, I was told to whisper my Blackness. And so I would go into spaces that were many times historically predominantly white, and I would learn to, as you would on a dial on a, you know, TV or something, turn it down, like turn down your Blackness, okay? So that you'll be accepted. You won't ruffle feathers, you won't offend people by the virtue of your Blackness. And Austin Channing Brown,
a woman, so you are both.
Exactly, going back to, you know, Crenshaw and others, and intersectionality, you know, the fact that, you know, we live these, you know, very nuanced lives at intersections. And Austin Channing Brown wrote this book called I'm Still Here, and I just read that over the summer, one of the texts that really was feeding me. And she wrote, it can be dangerous for Black women to attempt to carve out space for themselves, their perspectives, their gifts, their skills, their education, their experiences in place that haven't examined the prevailing assumption of white culture. And I mean, I could just spend hours on that, but I mean, just I wrote truth, grace, bounce back ability, made up a word because I love doing that. I don't like the term resilience because it's been co-opted, but myriad entry points, modeling the challenging moments. You know, I said, like, to answer this question of how to cultivate the atmosphere, to have the conversations like you and I are having right now, like, I have to name my locations and my identities, because if I don't, I'm not standing in the truth of this work, right? Because my locations at the intersections of Black, woman, generation where I was born means I'm received in certain ways. And so to push the boundaries of how we define and enact our progressivism to move further in the direction of a progressive education that holds a radical anti-racist praxis at its core, as opposed to one that's performatively anti-racist, as opposed to one that is of the narrative and the ideology of we've been doing this, because that gets us in very bad places. Some would say run off into a ditch, and we don't want to be in a ditch with this work. So What are your thoughts in,
Yeah,
response?
well, I think that's one of the reasons why that question about the story Bank Street tells of itself is an important one, because of its progressive history, of its long history of naming social justice. You have to be very careful that we don't say we've been there, been doing it all the time, that we have to be on a road of growth and rethinking. So, I mean, I think that's one big um, aspect of the place that we both work now that's important to do. And it's not necessarily an easy conversation, um, because it may raise questions about icons that are important, that are defining. Um, it's like what Glaude does, and I does again in the book The Begin Again. He does this, I think, really interestingly, but he takes figures like George Washington, and he doesn't discard George Washington. He doesn't discard Thomas Jefferson at all. But he says you have to remember they're human beings with flaws.
That's right. That's right.
And so that's the nature of, I think, institutions too. They're grand, they do great things, but they have flaws. So, and I'm not suggesting a particular flaw for Bank Street at all. I'm just saying that the question about really being careful about the story we tell ourselves is important. Yeah.
It really is. And I feel like the word even comes up, right? Because that is something that has been said a lot, like even Bank Street. And I am at the place where I'm ready to challenge that statement and that spirit of even Bank Street. Because why not Bank Street? Because Bank Street is an institution in a society that is defined by these ideologies of whiteness's most valued property. So it can't escape the air that's been breathed and the water that we've been swimming in, right? I mean, and I think it goes back to thinking about Begin Again, the chapter on the lie, and the ways that, Uncle Jimmy beautifully, lays out what the lie is. And the fact that no one can escape the lie. If you live in this society, it's a matter of how aware you are of the lie. And so for Bank Street, it's about how aware are we of the ways that the lie has infected us, because it has, because we're in this society. We can state that we aren't as affected by it for certain reasons and the ways that we locate ourselves philosophically, epistemologically, but the truth is we're infected. It's about how we move in the midst of that infection to mitigate it and then to eradicate it.
Yeah.
And so what you were saying really brings to the surface how we move in our courses in terms of how we conceive of them and how we enact them. One thing that I've begun doing more, I want to do more and more of this, and it takes a lot of time in between green bean feedings, but I get it in there, right? Which is, I'm not kidding, sadly, but which is putting and troubling in a beautiful way, right? Like no one is sacrosanct. And I've had this discussion with my students this semester, for example, about I put Dewey in conversation with Lee Patel, right? Because they are educational theorists who lived in very different eras, but two very committed, strong educators and educational researchers. But the fact that looking at two different educators across time, one who we can trouble while also holding on to all that he gave us in terms of theory, in terms of practice in Dewey, but also holding Dewey's, feet to the fire about what wasn't there and what could have been there, what should have been there in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of the oppressions, and the ways that Lee Patel, for example, says that schools are sites of racialization, whether we want to see it or not. And so having students understand that we're not saying throw Dewey out necessarily. We're saying, what are the things we can take from Dewey that we can use, and what are the ways we can trouble Dewey, which we should, because we shouldn't hold anyone in the canon. And that's another topic that we're talking about, and that I'm in that canon group, right? But we're like, who's in the canon and why? And even if we say someone is like, you've been granted entry into the canon, you've been in the canon, that doesn't mean that you're a sacrosanct. It means that you're in the canon, and we're going to use you and learn from you with a critical eye and stance, because no one's work, no one's body of work should be above reproach, because otherwise we run the risk of allowing dangerous ways of seeing children and families to live when they should be troubled.
That's actually one reason why I returned to In a Shade of Blue, because in that book, Cloud starts with Dewey, because Cloud's a pragmatist. He's a philosopher. He's a pragmatist, and so he doesn't want to throw Dewey out. He wants to recognize that Dewey did not participate in things that he should have, that were going on at his time. And I think Cloud says he, really believes he should have, but he didn't. And so those are limits for Dewey. But Dewey's way of approaching a problem, way of thinking about certain kinds of issues, Cloud wants to use. He wants to recognize as valuable ways of rethinking history, actually, and various aspects of in the Shade of Blue. It's actually of Black religious thought. So yeah, it's that part of Cloud, how he is so clear about understanding people's thinking as human thinking, and that it's going to have its limits and it's going to have its strengths. And it's up to us to really find those and determine what they are, and not to canonize in the sense of making a person a saint in any way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well said. Like not to canonize that. And I think that that's something that we can use as almost like a mantra, like not to canonize, but to beautifully problematize.
Yes.
Right? To think about the ways that we should problematize. Like someone was bringing up the fact that we're talking about people evolve over time. And I think it is important to see someone in what we can find as the fullness of their body of work, and seeing why they grew or not, because some people didn't, but some people did. And why did those who grew, why did they grow and the others didn't? And there is always a reason. And I think that that is an exploration that would serve our students well, because the path that we are forging with them is one that I know, hope that they see as thinking about a garden as a seed bed that they're tending, that we're tending with them while they're at Bank Street. And then once they step out into the world themselves, that they are taking charge of tending that garden and knowing that it's a lifelong endeavor, that there's no like, well, that's done. Where's the pen? Checking that off. Like that doesn't happen. And if it does, which some people do in the world do that, that means you're not doing the work. And we're hoping that we're cultivating, in students, and co-cultivating, of course, these dispositions of, I guess, endurance, right? Like enduring in this work, in the midst of the discomfort, and also knowing that a part of having these conversations is accepting the reality that these are going to be really uncomfortable conversations, and developing a lexicon, a vocabulary to have these conversations. And that's both within oneself and then with others. So knowing that there are things you want to say, and when someone says something that rubs you the wrong way as you're doing this work, being able to call them in or call them out. I've had this discussion recently with students about that, and when to call in, when to call out, and that it's not a perfect dance, but it's one that you can only get better at by doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping that we as a faculty are doing is learning better that and being able to call in and call out ourselves, in terms of what we know and what we don't know. When you think about, and been thinking a lot about leadership in this regard. And in our cabinet, we've been doing a series of thinking about leadership in relationship to issues of social justice, and particularly issues of racial justice. And thinking about the power we have as leaders, and then how that power gets used and misused. Are we even conscious of using it, or of it just not even consciously using it, but just, as a white person, I have a certain amount of power that's ascribed to me, just, and I have to recognize that, and how does that influence things? I think because I've been a dean for a long time, I've thought about this for a long time. And one of the things that I learned, this goes back a little bit to my biography, but one of the things that I learned at LIU, and I realized that as a white dean, I had certain powers to affect certain things happening. I could either ignore or I could push. And, we were a largely white faculty with a staff that was largely women of color, with a student body that was largely students of color. The white students were very often immigrants, Russian immigrants, first generation, or even immigrants themselves. So we were not, as sort of white educators, we were working with our colleagues, staff colleagues, and with our student body. If we didn't recognize our whiteness in all of that, and recognize the issues that emerged from all that, then we weren't going to be able to do our job. And it was actually, that was a major part of my work there. It became, because I really, and it was the issue of the power I had as a leader, because I could decide to push on that issue and direct attention there, or I could decide to ignore it as it had been ignored. So I think about that a lot. And, instructors have a great deal of power too.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, what you're saying about the position of leader and the lens the leader brings to the learning situation or the institution can make or break that racial literacy or consciousness work. And because it is ongoing, that's one of the reasons why there's this new series on Haymarket, from Haymarket Books, called Study and Struggle, which I've been learning a lot from. And I agree, it's on abolition, which is one of the frames we're taking up this semester in 530. And one of the only ways for leaders, instructors, teachers, teacher educators, everyone, I believe, is to engage in that ongoing study and struggle. That studying is a way of struggling towards freedom, towards justice, towards like an enduring justice and equality. I think that Cornel West was saying that, I hope I'm not misquoting you, Dr. West, but underlying justice is mercy and love, right? And the way to get there to that justice is by studying and struggling. We're talking about, like, the studying is not, there's no end to it. There just isn't. Like in that amazing talk that you and I'm sure thousands of others have seen with, Cornell and Eddie from Haymarket Books in June, I believe it was. Who knows now? Time is weird, but I think that was June this year. And they say how even they, who I imagine have schedules that would just make anyone weary looking at, they get together at least once a month for a book to do study.
Yeah.
And so it makes and that they're to be this conversant, that people might think like, oh, well, they're writing books, they're teaching, they're digital. In it, they're doing that work of studying and struggling. And that's one of the reasons why it is at the ready, why they can have 5 podcasts a day, as I think Dr. West was saying that he was up to one day last week, because it's at the ready. You're sitting with people who were in your group of critical friends and parsing texts and keeping one another honest about the ways you're showing up in this work. And that's one of the things that I hope and I believe that we're doing and need to continue doing and doing more and pushing it with our students and with ourselves. Like you're saying, it's a mirrored process, that it's not them or us, it's all of us needing to do this work at every level of the institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things that I think about a lot, Pam, is study alongside urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm totally with you in terms of, I see reading as action. I see meeting with other people around a book or set of ideas as action, because it prepares me, it prepares others who are with me to be in the world in a different way, to think about, to notice things in a different way, and to act in a different way. But that act of preparation that you're describing, like with Cloud and West, but it can be felt as a tension between urgent action and study, which feels so. I guess it has a sense of being passive. I never thought about study as being passive, but it can feel that way, and that's an ongoing, I think, a tension that we can feel, and certainly I know that exists for a lot of our colleagues in terms of thinking about where to put energy. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad you surfaced that, Cecelia, because it's something that I think about increasingly so often. Because like you, I don't see deep critical study of these texts and engaging in deep critical dialogue as passive, unless that's where it stays. If that's where it stays, then it is passive, I think. But if we take that and use that to inform our action, and that we do have an action plan, and what time is more in need of action and myriad and very layered and nuanced action than the current moment, when we're on the precipice of real possible change at a time that is really characterized by a precarity that most of us have never seen. I mean, the level of fear, the level of anxiety. Gab's like, I have things to say about this. I'll be done in a minute, Gabs. She always has things to say. But is this moment demands action, in different ways. Like one of the ways is protesting, right? And many of our students have been involved in the protest, and I think that, and I'm sure many of us, and I think that that needs to be a part of it. I think of it as like a pie chart, and it's not either or, it's both and. It's like, so we need to study and struggle. We need to be in the streets. We need to be thinking about it from the policy end. There's so many different aspects of how to fight, and the fight is real. And no matter who, thinking about the election, because it's kind of like the zoo in the room, forget the elephant, it's every animal in the room right now, that we're going to have to fight no matter what happens next week. The fight may look different in some ways, but it's going to take some serious, engaged, ongoing struggle. It is.
Yeah. And I think what is interesting too about, our Bank Street student body and ourselves, but is the degree to which people feel that sense of urgency. And I think that's increased tremendously among, and I'm it's always a little bit, very disconcerting to me that often our white students do not feel that urgency, or haven't fully thought about the importance of these issues in relationship to their teaching. That's a it's sort of one of the pieces of reality that I think we all deal with.
Mhm.
And that's part of my um, ongoing thinking about Bank Street. I wrote that letter in the fall to students for that reason. I want our students of color to feel a home in Bank Street, and to know that they have a welcome place, and that we are ready to hear them and to truly listen to them and learn from and teach. um, but I want the white students to know too that this is something they need to be engaging in, and that we're going to be helping them engage in that. But it is always disconcerting to me that I need to do that.
Oh, it's just so well said. And I remember that letter, and it left a real necessary impression. And I thank you for writing that. It set an important and necessary tone for the work that we're doing. And it really just was so resonant. And like you're saying, it's important to remember that for our white students, they can choose to engage or not. Our students of color always have to engage. We are always at these locations, that we can't opt out.
Mhm.
Not that we want to, but society has placed us in a situation, historically, politically, otherwise, where we always have to be engaged in this fight, whether we want to or not. And even if we opt out, we've opted in some ways that we don't even realize.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that I think is important for our white students to know, is that's one of the reasons why they have to be involved in this work in an ongoing way. So that I've heard this a lot over the years, a little less now, but it's still there because the work is real. And where students, and particularly white students who teach in predominantly white settings, or as Dr. Carr would say, historically white settings, that they often say, and honestly, and so I welcome the question, because it opens the space for some critical discussion and hopefully some good, meaty conversation and enlightenment and epiphanies being had. But when they say things along the lines of, well, my student body is largely white and affluent, so there's not a lot for me to do. And they say, oh, but there is. Let's talk about what that is, what that stuff is, and why and how. Let's talk about that. What do you think? Now, thankfully, thinking about Bank Street as a garden, as a beautiful large garden that we're tending, we've been planting a lot of seeds in the last 5 years, especially about racial consciousness in particular. And I feel like we're all seeing those fruits and those veggies sprouting, maybe even green beans gabs, sprouting, where students, when we throw that question back to the large group, many students have answers now, whereas years ago they'd be like, oh, I agree with that, because I too teach in a setting very similar and I don't really have any occasion to, as opposed to now you see a lot of hands, now virtual hands saying, wait, I need to say something. It's like, yes, you're number 7 or 10 in the queue. So there's been a shift in the ways that people are responding.
That's great. Yeah. And I that heartens me in terms of where we've come and are moving with what I hope is some small societal shifts. I think so. I'm hoping that we're able to continue to ask ourselves the really hard questions.
Yeah, I do too. And I also hope, I really hope that we are ready and willing to move in the direction of growing more uncomfortable, and growing more comfortable with the discomfort that comes with digging deeper. Because I think that, and again, thinking about the spiral that, our group in the last 2 years prior to this one for the racial literacy with the spiral that we,
Yes.
came up with. It's not linear for sure, because this work will take you up here and all the way back in 2 seconds. You're like, wait, I'm back there? How did I get back there? And then you go to the middle and you're up again. And that's just how it is. And that takes a lot of bounce back ability. It takes a lot of patience and grace with oneself and with others. And with that, I think that's where the both and comes in for me again, because I think it's important to have grace for ourselves and others in this work. And I will believe that, until my dying day. And I think it's also important not to mistake grace for not pushing people when they should be pushed, or pushing ourselves when we need to be pushed. So I say that to say that I feel like one of the many areas where we still have growth, where everyone does, in this work, I'm sure every institution, I can say that for every one that I've been a part of, is that not pulling back from doing this work for fear of hurting someone's feelings. And I still hear that a lot. And I feel it myself from having been socialized to perform whiteness. So I understand. I'm not like, wait, what? I'm like, no, I get that, because for so long, that's what I've done. But I realize the consequences are just too dire to do that. And I can't be a part of that project anymore, because that's not a project of liberation. That's a project of assimilation and a project of the status quo. And so in thinking about the ways that we are performing the work of interruption, as faculty, and modeling this forward with our students, it would really be beautiful for us to be able to model the ways that we keep pushing, even at the risk of potentially making someone feel acutely uncomfortable, knowing that we're coming from a good place, right? So if, for example, I heard an example recently where someone shared that they were talking about white supremacy, and they got the reaction of, ooh, don't say that. And the thing is, no, we have to say that. Whether you say white supremacy, whiteness is property. I mean, we have so many rich examples of we need to push back. Thinking about 45 and the campaign against critical race theory, the campaign against anti-racist trainings, and the 1619 Project. We have to say it. We have to say it. We've got to say it.
Well, I'm thinking as you're speaking, Pam, and thinking about comfort, discomfort. Your question to me earlier about how would I do that differently in North Dakota was an uncomfortable question for me. And it really, it makes me, but very thought-provoking. And again, I'm raising it now again, not because I have an answer to you or any additional thoughts than what I had. I would give anything, however, I will say, to be in conversation with Vito about those times and to think together. I mean, he's gone, so I can't do that. And that's part of the reason I think why I can't fully answer. But the question is uncomfortable to think about, and I appreciate that. But I think that was that's a good example of a point, one of the points you were making there. As I think the question is I'll say it again, of the story Bank Street tells itself. I think that's that has the potential of being an uncomfortable question in a productive and generative way. You can ask uncomfortable questions in ways that shut things down too, and we have to. That's not what you're talking about, right, or how I'm understanding it. No, but I think it's a really important and potent point for all of us, and who wants to be uncomfortable?
Right. I mean, like, who wants to be?
We don't want to be, but we have to be if we're going to grow. And
That's right. I mean, it so much goes back to, like, if we use the analogy of exercise, right? And when we think, I've worked that muscle, this is such an easy workout. I wasted my. You wake up the next morning like, oh my goodness, I can't move. I thought I moved that muscle. I have that muscle there, and I feel like that is really a good example of this work, that there's so many muscles when it comes to racial literacy and racial consciousness that I tell my students, it's not the bug, it's the feature. It's the feature to not work these muscles so that they atrophy, right? And so that we get to a place where we can't work them out.
Mhm.
And that's why we have to pick up that bigger kettlebell
Mhm.
of racial consciousness that feels too heavy to lift, and maybe do a subtle bend so we don't pull our back or pull a muscle that'll like take us out for too long, but not be so afraid to pick that up and say, this is not going to be easy. I might even like dislike it,
Mhm.
but I think I need to do it anyway.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, not doing it in a way that people feel torn down or it's antagonistic, but the discomfort is going to be there. And like I tell folks, if it feels always comfortable, then something's not going right.
Mhm.
Like I was a part of a training um, months ago where I felt acutely uncomfortable, and I thought, this does not feel good. And then as I reflected on it, I was like, that was really good. Like, I didn't like it in the moment. In fact, inside I was screaming. I was like, I don't like this. I want this to end right now. And I reflected for days and days. And I realized with every passing day, Cecelia, I said, that was a gift. And to this day, I now am so informed by it. One of the gifts I got from that deep, deep discomfort that was brought by one of the workshop goers, who almost kind of stopped the whole conversation and said, I'm sorry, may I say something? Why are we tiptoeing around this? Why are we not naming things as they are? And I said, no, say more. And they brilliantly laid out the fact that they said, no offense, but we are not naming race. We're not naming the fact they're talking about Black and brown children right now. We've gone into that general, not being specific, trying not to offend. Why are we doing that? And that was an important moment for me, right? Because in my quest to make sure that everyone felt comfortable, I'd allowed us to veer off into the space of vagueness that really wasn't helping us.
Mhm.
And I thank that person for being that kind of monitor and that gaze. And so even now, when I'm going into conversation at the top of this semester, I said, may I offer to us another norm of, I don't know how to name it, folks, maybe you can help me. I said this and no one came with a name because it's hard to name, but like when we start to stray, the bring backer, the person who brings us back, the person who says, oh no, we're straying, we're going off because that's what the project of whiteness wants us to do. It wants us to veer off into this place of vagueness and not doing the work. How do we bring ourselves back? And so those moments of acute discomfort are, I have now found, as much as in the moment they don't feel good, they even hurt.
Mhm.
They are these gifts that keep on giving over time. They're like, for me, that Christmas gift that I would get as a kid. And you think on that day that you've like unearthed every possible like bell and whistle, and you're like, that's done. And then weeks later, you're like, it does that too?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, that's how this experience and those moments of like rich deposits of discomfort are.
Mhm.
If you keep digging in them, if you don't run away from them, they're like, I know I'm not the most fun to be around right now, but I have a lot that you can learn from me if you just stop, take a breath, even take a rest, because this work takes rest. Because if you don't rest and give yourself a minute to catch your breath, you won't continue. And I feel like that's what Bettina Love and others help us think about with joy in this work. We want to make sure that we don't lose the joy.
Mhm.
That's a part of this work. And going back to James Baldwin, who's been with us from the top of our conversation, he said, hope is invented every day, right? And so that's a part of this excavation, is excavating the hope in this work so that we can endure. Because if it's all just like, it's so heavy, I have no joy, no hope, you won't be able to come back. There is no bounce back ability, right?
No, that's right. And the thing also, and I'm going to go back to another thread of our conversation, which has to do with um, text, and that is that you can be made uncomfortable by a direct question in the way that you did with me, direct conversation, or you can come upon a reading and you're reading it and you say, I can't go any farther. And you might close the book. And that's happened to me. And then you go, you need to go back, and you do. But the text has done that same thing for you. And it's that interaction between, it's an interaction the same way with a human being face to face or on Zoom or wherever, but it's that same kind of effect. And then actually too, when that starts to happen, that you're reading something important for you. I think.
Right. But I think that
So.
knowing that takes a certain cultivation of a disposition of growth, because if someone isn't at a certain level of awareness of where they want to go in this work, then they might shut that book, or they may go past that part that makes them feel acutely uncomfortable and say, oh, no, I don't know what they're saying here. I'm just going to go to the next chapter because they are really off the mark with that.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, oh, I had moments of that, like, oh, when I was reading Kendi, and I would close it and I would say, I'm coming back. I need to close it for now, though. I would close it and put it on the shelf. I take a deep breath, and this one would jump up in my lap and ask for green beans. And then I'd say, yes, time for a green bean break. And then maybe the next day, I'd come back and say, okay, onto the breach. Let's do this. I can't run from this. And I would say, what made me so uncomfortable with what he just wrote there? Why was that? And I had to ask myself all of these. So you're right. I mean, the same thing happens with text. And I want you to know, the question I asked you at the top, I asked you because it's the kind of question I'm asking myself all the time about past undertakings and things that I cite as very pivotal in my growth. And I go back and I'm always big on how would I do things, but would I keep the same and why, and what would I do differently and why? And inevitably, I'd always do something differently because I would need to, and it's always instructive and a good thought experiment for me. That's why I was just so excited to ask you that, because I'm always asking myself.
No, I was glad you did. Yeah.
I mean, your example brought to mind, I don't know if you've seen it, but this feels like a tangent, but it's not. It's just a slight veering off, but it's not totally. PBS, always in the clutch. I love PBS. They had this documentary years ago, I think 2012. It was on the Wampanoag. And it makes me think about Nelson's keynote and the entire language series, actually, because it was called We Still Live Here. And it was about how the Wampanoag were reviving their language. And they had taken full control of their learning. They had some assist, or one of the main within the Wampanoag community, in that community, educators, had some support from, I believe, Noam Chomsky when he was still at MIT, but it was truly led by the community in their education efforts. And it was a beautiful thing to see how that was, to me, I saw that clip, I saw it in 2012. And the ways I saw it then are very different from the ways I see it now.
Wow.
It was amazing. I mean, then I was blown away, as I still am now, but now I'm seeing what they did through a lens of decolonizing, which I didn't even use that word, that term then. I'm seeing it through a lens of abolition, as I certainly wasn't thinking about it then. And as my students and I viewed it a few weeks ago through the lens of abolition and decolonization, I think they were quite blown away by seeing that learning through those lenses. And so that's why I think, like Bettina says, that theory is our North Star, and that it gives us language to fight. And again, seeing the Wampanoag documentary clips now versus 2012, it was just a world of difference. And so I love that then and now, like, whoa, wow, how my thinking has shifted and thinking about where I will be maybe 12 years from now, or even 2 years from now. Who, I'll be like, then I wasn't thinking about, I was still saying fill in the blank.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And that actually gives me, but I won't go down this road right now, but I will keep thinking about it. It gives me a way of thinking about that work we did in terms of the structural benefit, but the degree to which the curriculum those folks were having to use, et cetera, really looking at that from a colonizing, decolonizing point of view would be really interesting to do. And we didn't do that.
Yeah.
So I think, I think I think about that with my whole history degree. I studied American history, for goodness sake. And when I read Stamped from the Beginning, I said, I learned some of this, but I didn't learn all of this. And so, it just holds a whole different slant. If I were to be now a major in American history, what I would be expecting, and I hope what I would be learning, that would be quite different from now, which is, that's a wonderful thing. That's the good thing about having a long life too,
It is. And assuming the position of being a lifelong learner. Like when we situate ourselves as being lifelong learners, then knowing that we're inevitably going to say, I hadn't thought of that way. That's seen as a positive as opposed to, oh, I can't believe I didn't think of that way, because we weren't there yet.
No.
We don't get there ever unless we're not breathing. Like, as long as we're drawing breath, we should still say there's more there to find.
Mm-hmm.
There's more yet to be, and so that's the beauty of that. And what do you think, this work is uniquely important for teacher ed programs? Cecelia, what do you think?
Why do I think that? What do I think it is. So I'll say that. It's uniquely important to teacher ed programs because teachers are working with, being with, living with young people, with peers. And if they're really going to engage in the human work of education, they have to be behaving in their best humanity. And that the only way I think you can engage with your full humanity is by being engaged in this kind of growth. I don't see any other way you can do it. I simply don't see any other way to do it.
Ooh, that is a mic drop moment right there. You would say a green bean drop moment. That is a mic drop moment for sure. I mean, that's, the fullness of our humanity. That's the only way to do this work. I agree completely, Cecelia. I think the consequences are just so dire that if we don't do it, that's why there's no option but to do it.
Right.
And so I agree completely. And one of the things that I think goes unsaid, but many of us feel is, as teacher educators, when we're working with a single pre-service, in-service teacher, a teacher leader, a child life specialist, they represent legions of children and families. And so that makes this even more consequential and even more dire. So we may have 28 students or 25, even 15, whatever the number is, exponentially thinking about the impact. And so that's what makes all of this, when I'm thinking about that, even more dire, because about futures. And so it goes back to planting and to cultivating, and the ways that we co-construct, co-cultivate these gardens of racial consciousness, and taking an anti-bias, anti-racist stance with them, that we are doing a service for the future of humanity, for the students, the children, young adults, teenagers, and families with whom they'll interact, because they'll touch so many lives, and some of the ways they touch those lives will inevitably be traced back to the ways that we touched them in terms of their awareness in their thinking, their knowledge, skills, dispositions when it comes to anti-racist, anti-bias work. So I think it's just, it's dire. And so I guess the last piece is, as Margie and Abby said, is like, what's next?
I think we've been talking about that, right?
I do too.
I think we've been talking about that. There's ongoing learning, ongoing struggle, and ongoing questioning and pushing. I think those are the next steps.
Yeah,
Pushing those steps. Yeah.
I think so too. I think it's going to take the work that we're doing and then just the iterations on that work,
Yes.
and never falling into the trap of complacency.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, I think that there's specific work around progressivism and anti-racist work.
Yes.
And really being thought leaders, dare we say, in that field of all of the progressive talk that happens in these circles, and saying how we locate ourselves as progressive educators and how we challenge progressivism to another location of truly anti-racist work and what that means and looks like. And again, not falling back on the we've been doing this, but the fact that what does that mean in 2020 as we've had this collective reawakening at the intersection of the twin, even more than twin, pandemics of, anti-racism, anti-Blackness, and COVID-19. And, to quote Arundhati Roy, it always comes back to this quote about the pandemic being a portal. Like, and this really is a portal, like in the midst of this utter and even indescribable devastation. Like, it really does, almost, it's beyond description what so many people are going through, and what we're going through collectively as a nation and as a world. That this does also provide an opportunity for growth and rebirth. And so how do we seize this moment of walking through this portal? Like, people will be reading, like someone said last night, we need to be journaling, and journaling kind of furiously, so that those who come after us will be able to read and feel a bit of what we were experiencing, to learn from this time. Because history is nothing, you being an historian is nothing if not like these cycles, and you'll see things come up again in decades and centuries. So when those who are far in the future from us are looking back on, wow, way back in 2020 when, whoa, that was happening, how can we learn from that as we're at the portal moment, as we're on this precipice of what seems to be utter devastation and yet possible true transformation, right? And so,
and I think on that note, I should say thank you, Pam.
I should say thank you, Cecelia. And I thank you, Gabs, for not totally crashing and Zoom bombing us. Thank you.
Okay.
He was almost there, but thank you so much for having this conversation.
Oh, this is great. I really, I loved it. Thank you.
I did as well. And once I finish beginning again, maybe we can have some virtual tea and talk about it.
That would be nice. Yes, good. Okay.
I like that. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you tonight for the cause event.
You certainly will. I'll be there. Okay.
Take care.